Oh, great, thank you so much. This is the third workshop for the Energy Facility Siting Council's Protected Area Scenic Resources and Recreation Standards Rulemaking. The first two meetings focused on some more general applicability issues and the protected area standard issue. And today we're going to be focusing on the scenic resources and recreation standards mostly, although we can certainly look at some other issues as folks want and time allows. And I guess just before I go further, make sure everybody can hear me okay. And also, if you're dialing in on the phone or joining us otherwise, I would ask you to mute yourselves unless you're speaking, just so we don't get all that background noise. And then Wally, I'll actually, if you're still listening, I will have you remind me. I know this should be on our instructions on our webpage, but if you are dialing in on the phone and you wish to mute yourself through WebEx, I believe that is *3.
I'm going to have to look. I can put that in the chat.
Okay.
*3 is, I think, to raise your hand. I'm not sure what the mute is. So
that must be *6.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, and then for everyone else, you should have in your participants pane a little hand icon at the bottom that allows you to raise or lower your hand. And hopefully you all have gotten the hang of that by now, but if not, I can pull up the instructions page as we go along. Okay, so to start off, we're going to do a brief round of introductions, and then we'll get right into the issues that we have identified for today's workshop. The first two issues, so hopefully the first half of this meeting, will discuss appropriate study areas and methods for impact analyses under the three standards that we're looking at in this rulemaking. Most of the feedback that we've received so far on these issues have been related to visual impacts. So that's going to be our focus, but we would appreciate hearing on other impacts or other issues related to study areas and the methodologies that you wish to provide. And then the second set of issues were raised by stakeholders earlier in these proceedings, and those are related to the methods used to identify significant or important scenic resources under the scenic resources standard and important recreational opportunities under the recreation standard. Finally, we'll close out the meeting with closing remarks you'd like to make, and then we'll discuss next steps. At this point in time, we do expect for this to be the final workshop on this rulemaking, but we can reassess that at the end of this meeting. I will just say now that we do intend to prepare our updated issues analysis, reflecting the conversations we've had during all three workshops, and prepare our recommendations and draft proposed rules, and then send them out for review before we go back to the council with draft proposed rules. So that's what we're thinking now, but we can kind of revisit that at the end of the meeting. Okay, and so to do introductions, looks like we have about 21 folks on the phone. So I'm just going to go ahead and call down the list. If you want to introduce yourself, tell us what organization you're representing, and make any brief opening remarks, we'd welcome that. So I'm going to start with people that are signed in through the webinar, and then I'll go to people on the phone. So let's start with Angela.
Hi there, Angela Crowley-Cook. I'm the Executive Director of ASEA.
Thank you, Angela. Welcome. Brian Kelly.
Hi, Brian Kelly with Greater Hells Canyon Council.
So welcome, Brian. Chad?
Hello, I'm an analyst for NL Green Power North America.
So welcome. Chris Knopf?
Hi, my name is Christopher Knopf. I do national scenic and historic trails as well as transportation, road and trail designation for the Bureau of Land Management in Oregon and Washington. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, and welcome. Welcome. David Stanish?
Hello, this is David Stanish with the Idaho Power Company.
Welcome, David. Diane Brand?
Hi, Diane Brandt. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager with Renewable Northwest.
Welcome, Diane. Fuji Kreider?
Hi, Fuji Kreider, concerned citizen in LeGrand, Oregon, and also a member of the Stop B2H Coalition. Thank you.
Welcome, Fuji. Jeff Mafuccio?
Hi, Jeff Mafuccio with Idaho Power.
Welcome. Jocelyn Pease?
Jocelyn Pease with McDowell Reckner Gibson for Idaho Power.
Welcome. Lena Cope?
Hi, Lena Cope with Portland General Electric.
Welcome. Mark Salvo?
Mark Salvo with Oregon Natural Debtors Association in Bend, Oregon.
Welcome, Mark. Matt Hutchinson?
Hello, it's Matt Hutchinson with Avant-Garde Renewables.
Welcome, Matt. Meg Frisbee?
Good afternoon. This is Meg. I'm a cultural resources specialist with the National Park Service National Trails Office, and my colleague Laura Roselle brought this meeting to our attention, and unfortunately she can't be here today. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I got a notice that she was out in the field, but we're very happy that some of our federal agency partners can be here today. So thanks so much for joining.
Good to be here.
Mike Tody?
Good afternoon, Mike Tody, Conservation Director with the Oregon Hunters Association.
Mike. Natalie Rodriguez?
Hi there, Siting Manager at NL Green Power.
Welcome, Natalie. Rachel Katz?
Hi, this is Rachel Katz. I'm with Tetra Tech.
Rachel. And I have somebody joining by a phone who's just marked down as Scott. Scott, if you'd like to introduce yourself, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll move to folks on the phones. Okay, and so here's the tricky part. So I have a call-in number from a 541 number with the phone number ending in 15.
Yeah, it's Susan Gear, a concerned citizen and a botanist concerned about rare plants.
Welcome, Susan. You can join us today. And then I have one more 541 number. Oh, that looks like I just lost. So thank you all for joining us. Is there anybody I missed who may have joined while we were doing introductions? So feel free to just jump in and introduce yourselves. And then I'll have our staff introduce themselves as well.
This is Jimmy Kagan. I'm with the Institute for Natural Resources and manage the Oregon Managed Area Protected Areas database.
Excellent. Welcome, Jimmy. Okay, and hearing no one else, Sarah, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself to the group?
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Sarah Esterson. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with the Department of Energy Siting Division.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for being here and for your time. We know this is a big commitment to take time out of your day and join us, but we really do appreciate all the feedback that we can get, especially on these issues, which I think we can all agree are near and dear to many of our hearts. Protected areas, scenic resources, and recreation opportunities are things that most of us care about a lot, and it's really important to make sure that we can, balance the needs for providing some regulatory certainty to our energy developers and certificate holders, while making sure that the council can really address impacts to these resources and to Oregonians in general. So looking forward to a good conversation and, tough conversations at some points in time, but we think that these workshops have been really productive so far, and we're hoping that we can get some good input on these issues, which were actually, many of which were raised by you also. With that, I think we can move on to our first issue. And go from there. So the first thing that we have on our list for today is whether the study areas for impacts to protected areas, recreation opportunities, and scenic resources are appropriately sized. As a little bit of background, the study area is the area which must be evaluated for potential impacts to resources in the notice of intent. There's different study areas for different types of resources and impacts. The information in the NOI is then used to identify the analysis areas for the application. Those analysis areas may be different than the study areas used in the for the NOI, but they can also be the same. And that analysis area is the area that would contain resources that the proposed facility could potentially significantly affect. Some stakeholders have recommended reducing the study area sizes for these three standards, especially for renewable facilities and solar photovoltaic power generation facilities. To give just a little additional background on this, the current study areas in the rule include the area within the site boundary of a proposed energy facility, plus a 5-mile buffer for recreational opportunities, a 10-mile buffer for scenic resources, and a 20-mile buffer for protected areas. The NOI must generally identify the resources within these study areas that could potentially be impacted by the proposed facility, and then the department uses that information to establish the analysis areas that will be used to develop the more in-depth impact analyses in the application. The current Division 21 rules kind of describe what different impact analyses must be provided as part of the application. The three standards require several different types of impacts to be analyzed, some of which overlap and some of which do not. All three of the standards requires an impact of the analysis, an analysis of the impact of facility structures and plumes. Both the protected areas and recreation standards require analyses of noise and traffic impacts. And then the unique analyses are the protected area standard requires an analysis of impacts on water quality and quantity inside of protected areas. The scenic resources standard requires an analysis of the impacts of loss of vegetation and landscape alteration will have on the scenic resources. The recreation standard requires an analysis of loss of recreation opportunity. I'll just note that in some cases, a resource can be protected under multiple standards, and in that case, all the different requirements would potentially apply. So we'll probably be looking at whether or not this Venn diagram is correctly laid out when we're doing our application process review rulemaking, which is currently just getting started. But we thought it'd be helpful to highlight these differences to inform the discussion about what the appropriate basis for the study areas are. Also to help promote that discussion, we've identified a few different discussion questions. And so this is where I guess we'll start asking for input. I think I'm going to try to go through these one by one. If that doesn't work, we can kind of skip around, but for now, I'll go ahead and ask anybody if you have advice on what the appropriate basis for establishing these study area distances are, and if there's any specific evidence or information or other examples that we should be looking at when we make our recommendation to the council. So if you have thoughts on that, I'll look for anybody to raise their hand.
Chris, sorry to interrupt, but you're not advancing the slides on what we're seeing.
Thanks so much. I was wondering
So you mentioned the
about
Venn
that.
diagram that I think anyone realized that we should be seeing something different.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Let me try to restart my screen sharing here. Thought I could be fancy and share this presentation and not the screen.
I wasn't watching, Chris, but yeah, so we're seeing your first slide again now, the cover slide.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, it's still on your cover slide. Yeah, okay. Now you stop sharing.
Let's just try to start over. Well, and if anybody does have thoughts while I'm getting this up, please do go ahead. I think I see what the problem was. Okay, are you seeing new slides now?
Yep, that's working now.
Great, okay. Thank you all for your patience and yeah, sorry for that technical glitch. So I'll skip ahead to, here's the Venn diagram that I was just discussing. So as you can all see, the rules do require visual impacts of structures and plumes in all three standards, but then there's these different analyses required under the different standards. And did anybody have any comments or questions on this slide specifically?
I have one question. This is Angela from OSEA.
Go ahead, Angela.
Is the impact analysis for after the project is completed, or does it include construction?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time? Does the impact analysis of what require?
I'm wondering if the impact analysis includes the construction of the project, or if it's for what things will be like after the project is constructed.
I do believe it varies from impact to impact. So I think water use and water disposal do actually require an impact of impacts during construction, as would the noise and traffic impacts in some cases. I know our noise standard more generally excludes a lot of construction impacts, but for impacts to these, I think we would be looking at the temporary impacts associated with construction as well. And Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong on any of that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
I do think, for things like loss of vegetation or landscape alteration, we on those impacts on scenic resources, we would be looking at the temporary impacts, but would also be considering any, revegetation or restoration as the kind of final determination of what those long-term impacts would be. Okay.
Sorry, one more question. So can you back up the slides and remind us what the issue is that we're considering?
Sure. So what we're looking at is whether the study areas for impacts to the 3 standards are the correct sizes.
And is there a reason why this issue has come up? And is there a reason it should be changed from the current sizes?
Yeah, a few stakeholders, I think including OSEA, recommended that we look at this and potentially reduce the sizes.
Got it. Thank you. I mean, I can speak to that since no one else is talking. Yeah, I think it is appropriate to reduce the size for solar, especially since for things like noise, there's no noise or very minimal noise coming from a solar facility. No pollution, there's doesn't seem to be a need to study this huge area when you can't really tell solar is there unless you're right in the middle of the solar project.
Sure, yeah, and I think so. Are you saying that the basis for making that decision should be on like the maximum extent of impacts?
Yes, I think so. I think that's what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah, and I mean I understand that you are also saying the maximum extent of impacts for solar facilities you believe is very low. Do you have any sources of information you would suggest we look at to kind of make that determination?
Not off the top of my head. Maybe some of my colleagues do, but I can look for some.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other hands up on this.
I'm not sure how to put my hand up, but if I could add something.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. And then I see that Fuji does have her hand up.
Okay. This is Dean Apostle. I'm a retired landscape architect from the Forest Service. I do some consulting work, and I've written a book called The Renewable Energy Landscape, which looks at pretty comprehensively the visual impacts of various renewable energy. And I can state with a high level of confidence that even solar PV, ground-mounted solar can have a visual impact that extends out quite a way. So I've got plenty of research to show this, and I can share that offline.
Great. Yeah, that would be, we'd appreciate seeing those resources.
Thanks.
Fuji?
It's more of a question, I guess, and it's confusing here because are you going to slice and dice this by resource or type of, whether it's a solar farm or wind farm, transmission line, whatever? It's hard for us to discuss this because it's multidimensional. So I guess, are you asking that we look at these study areas as a whole for all resources? It looks like the question you are talking about different distances for different facilities. Are you going to, in the issues or in the draft rules or whatever, differentiate them for us? Because we may have different inputs depending on, now we're talking solar, but I guess I want to know how you're going to process this.
Sure, and that's actually one of the things that we're looking for feedback on, is if we should be establishing different study area sizes for different types of facilities. The rules were written like that prior to, I want to say, 2007, and at that point we collapsed them down into these single study areas that we have now. So we could go back to that approach where we have a different sizes for wind facilities versus solar facilities, if that's people's preference, or if we can identify a good reason for doing that.
I guess that's what I was wondering. So at this point, you're going to keep them all the same until we
Yeah,
hear the rest. Okay.
at this
okay,
point, we
that's what
don't
I
have a
wanted.
recommendation. Yeah,
Okay.
just trying to get
Okay, that's-
feedback.
Thank you.
Although I will note that in the climate executive order, that was one of the things discussed was having different processes and standards for different types of facilities, which we think is a really good idea.
Great. Thank you for that. I have Irene and then Brian. Go ahead, Ms. Gilbert. Okay, Irene, for some reason, we're not getting your audio, although I do see that you're unmuted.
So if I can jump in for a second, this is Wally and Irene. If you can hear us, if you click on the little arrow next to your mute, unmute, it'll give you your audio options. And, there you can look for what microphone is selected and, maybe try a different microphone if you can.
Now?
Oh yeah, we're hearing you now.
Okay, great. Well, I guess I'll use that then. Anyway, what I was saying is I would be very concerned about making the area for wind farms any smaller because for one thing, they're getting taller and taller. And so the area of impact is huge. When it comes to solar facilities, I can understand why developers would be interested in a smaller area. However, they're relatively new in terms of on the landscape. And so my concern is, I don't think we're really clear on, for instance, the impacts to wildlife. I'm concerned about the glare, the reflection from them, and without any actual data, it's hard to know what would be an appropriate reduction in area. So I would hesitate to make much smaller areas until we actually know how far, like for instance, when you go into Pendleton, there's that huge solar farm there. And if that were on flat area, you would be able to see the reflection for miles, would be what I would assume anyway, because it's really bright when you head down into that valley. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Irene. Brian?
Hi, everybody. Let's see, before I forget, Sarah, when you're speaking, you're coming in real low volume compared to everybody else. So if there's any way to increase your volume, that would be appreciated by me. I would just second what the landscape architect and Fuji and Irene have recently said. I mean, we are very much in favor of renewables. However, we're sort of discovering some of the impacts as development happens, and then it's some of the impacts are already established. So I'm fairly cautious about the idea of restricting the area of analysis or potential impacts. I think that the idea of really looking for some research-based data to base where we go with this would be a really good idea. So yeah, I just want to voice a note of caution on that. So thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Jimmy? Jimmy, I see your hand up. I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can unmute you.
I was having an impossible time unmuting myself. Hey, my comment relates to that one of the problems with this discussion is that we're trying to answer all three questions at once. I think right now we may not understand the right size to assess impacts for different types of facilities, but it seems relatively obvious that the study areas may need to be different for different types of facilities. I know from an endangered species standpoint, which is something that we're experts on at the Oregon Biodiversity Information Center, they're really different. The impacts are very different to both types of endangered species or the types of wildlife that might be impacted and the area in which it may impact them. Similarly, the same thing is true for natural areas and protected areas. It depends on the type of protected area it is, and also depends on the type of facility it is. And so by having a one-size-fits-all plan, you sort of get the worst of all worlds. So I strongly recommend that study areas should be different for different types of facilities, that they should be both resource-based and impact-based, and that they should extend at least a bit beyond the borders of Oregon if they're right on the edge of the state. I got.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Susan?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is maybe beyond what we're talking about right now, but I started to become really concerned about insects, and it seems like there's no part of Oregon laws existing that are protecting insects that I know of. And I wonder if we know enough about some of these different types of structures to know what, I feel like that ought to be a part of it.
Yeah, I will say that I think you are correct that there are not specific statuses for invertebrates under like Oregon's wildlife laws, for example. And so that is something we're wrestling with. And I guess just to address a few of the comments that have been made, these three standards currently don't have specific study requirements in them around impacts on wildlife, and they don't really differentiate between protected areas that are protected for their biodiversity values, their ecological values, versus a protected area that's protected for its recreational or aesthetic values. So those are definitely things we're trying to parse out here as part of this process, and maybe continuing to work on throughout some of our other rulemaking projects.
So can I try to address that insect question in particular?
Yes, please do.
Okay, it turns out that in 1979 the state passed what they called the Oregon Natural Heritage Act, which has been morphed into the Oregon Natural Areas Act. And that law allows the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department to have a Section 6 agreement for rare, threatened, and endangered invertebrates in Oregon. Part of that agreement allows funding to come from the Fish and Wildlife Service, which does list threatened and endangered invertebrates, including a number of butterflies and fairy shrimp. They provide funding to the parks, which is managed by cooperative agreement with our office at Oregon State University, Portland State University, excuse me. And so there are a list of rare and at-risk invertebrates. If the Department of Energy wanted to use that list, it's developed cooperatively with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is true that neither Oregon Department of Agriculture nor the Department of Fish and Wildlife is willing to take it on. But there is a group of invertebrates that could be potentially used. There's information in the Oregon Biodiversity Information Center that could apply if people were interested in trying to include that in assessing resources.
Right. Yeah, that may or may not be outside of the scope of this rulemaking, but we'll definitely take a look at that and you know, try to, if that's not something we specifically look at now, we'll make a note to keep that on our docket for when we're looking at specifically the wildlife and threatened and endangered species standards later down the road. Since you've had your hand up for a little bit, I'm going to go with Angela and then Irene.
Thank you. A comment and a question. A comment in terms of this being a new technology. Just want to remind folks that the first utility scale solar project that we had in Oregon was in 2009. And so, you know, we've had 12 years of experience on that particular project. And after 2009, more utility scale projects all the time, every year in Oregon. So, you know, I'm not sure how much more time we need to fully understand the impacts. But my question was about should study areas extend beyond the borders of Oregon? And this is more of a legal question. I mean, I know that our laws can't extend beyond the borders of our state, and it seems a little strange to extend study areas beyond the borders. Does that happen in other states? It seems sort of unusual to me.
I'm actually not aware of what the practice for establishing analysis areas in other states would be. That's certainly something that we can look into. You know, I am not sure that Oregon law requires us to only consider impacts that occur within the borders of the state. That's certainly been something that's been recommended, though. So hopefully that addresses your question, but we can definitely look at the legal question more carefully as we're going forward. Okay, Irene?
If you don't mind me breaking in, I can't figure out how to get my hand up, so.
That's okay, yeah, it should be in your, if you click on the button that says participants, it should then be in the lower right-hand corner, but also feel free just to jump in if you
okay, if you don't mind. So a few years ago, I was involved in a wind energy project that was just outside the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area, and it was located in Washington State. But all of the visual impacts were located on the Oregon side of the Columbia River. And you know, there's a lot of instances, I think, where projects can be viewed from either side, from Washington or from Oregon. And I don't think we want to preclude the consideration of what those impacts are on either side. I agree with what the previous speaker said, that I don't know what the legal implications are. In this case, it was the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area. So the review was done within that context. But it is something that FSEC should be aware of and be thinking about.
Thanks, Dean. Yeah, and that's a good example of, you know, I know that management plan was enacted in part under a bi-state agreement, but it does make sense in some cases to say, you know, Oregon has a policy interest in protecting certain resources outside of the state, and the gorge, I think, is a great example of that. I do know, you know, back in ancient history when we were looking at the Trojan nuclear power plant, you know, the council did do an evaluation of the socioeconomic impacts that plant would have on the Kelso Longview area, because that was one of the major urban centers, even though that's in Washington itself too. So there have been a lot of examples where we have looked at impacts outside of the borders, and some reasons why we may want to continue to do so, although that might not be the case in every example. Irene?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I off mute? Okay. I'd like to support what Dean had to say in terms of the way I look at things like protected areas. Those aren't Oregon resources, they are public resources. And the same thing for resources in the state of Washington. Just because they happen to exist in Washington does not mean that the public at large doesn't have a vested interest. And my experience, at least with wind farms, has been there's been basically no consideration for the impacts outside of the state. And actually, when I raised my hand, I was intending to comment on the gorge and the fact that things that happen in Washington affect us very directly, and things that happen in Oregon affect them very directly. So, and that comment, but also I am concerned because with the protected areas standard, it lists a bunch of things that are reviewed, but as far as application, what FSAC has been looking at is just the issues that are listed in the management plan. So they've been, these protected areas, I'll grant you, they may have a specific component that is the focus of them being protected, but all of those issues that have to do with protected areas really impact all of them. And I'm concerned that there's a failure to deal with all of those issues in your circle. So I think it is worth really making some comments in the, I suppose, in the rules that say that all of those issues will be consideration. The other thing, just in terms of solar developments in particular, is I'll grant you that the first solar development may have happened in 2009, but with the focus now on renewable energy, the number of solar developments that are coming before FSAC, it's increasing exponentially. And so the next few years are going to see a huge increase in the number of solar developments. I am concerned about doing anything that's going to cause significant problems where hindsight is always 20/20. So that would be my comment on areas of impact for solar. And there are a lot of things like with birds that my understanding is that the solar facilities do pose a significant risk. And I know like with eagles, they're hunting within a 5 or 6 mile area of their nest. So there can be impacts for a long ways. Comment, that's it.
Thanks, Irene. Susan, I see you have your hand up, and Brian Kelly. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about migratory birds, and I guess Irene mentioned that, so that's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Brian, and then Jimmy, I think.
Yeah, this is Brian. Yes, I was also thinking about one of our protected areas in the Grand Ronde Valley is the Ladd Marsh Wildlife Area. And the wildlife that depend on that area do range quite a ways away from that area. So I do think it's important that we analyze the potential impacts to these very important resources. And as Susan just mentioned and Irene mentioned, migratory birds stop off at the refuge, but they come from a long ways north and they go a long ways south this time of year. We also have an elk herd that spend some of their time in the Ladd Marsh wildlife area, but then range out of it. Mule deer, very similar, and a host of other wildlife species. So the point is that a lot of their needs extend beyond the officially protected area, but potential impacts of development must analyze what their needs are in the connectivity of their important wildlife habitat. So I will leave it there.
Thanks, Brian. Jimmy, and I guess before we move on from that comment, I will acknowledge that we've heard a lot about analyzing impacts on wildlife within protected areas as being part of our process. And while those rules currently don't state that, I just want to make a note that we've heard that from several of you now, and we'll try to look at that closer. But if anybody does, have additional thoughts, we welcome hearing how and if we should be looking at wildlife differently when we do our analysis of protected areas. So with that, I'll say Jimmy and then Angela.
No, I think you already called on me.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I see your hand still up. I can go ahead and I think lower that for you.
Thanks.
Angela?
Yeah, I just had a question about the bird issue. I'm not an expert in birds. Can someone explain to me what would a potential negative impact be for birds of a solar project? I understand they're like, yeah, just leave it at that. help me understand. Thank you.
I saw Rachel's hand go up. So if you want to respond to that, Rachel, please do.
Sorry, no, I was getting in line, not with an answer.
Okay.
Angela.
Does anybody, if anybody does have particular expertise or the ability to respond to Angela's question, please go ahead. Otherwise, I can take a shot at it. Mark, did you want to respond?
I can offer some response. And, bird species differ, obviously, and migratory birds have different habitat needs than residential species that aren't leaving a particular area seasonally. But I'm most familiar with greater sage grouse. And so to the inquiry, sage grouse, it turns out, are a species that can be particularly sensitive to disturbance within a particular parts of their habitat. So even if a development type were to, some sort of development, and it need not be renewable energy development, any kind of development were to occur, say, within 3 or 4 miles of a sage grouse breeding site called a lac, that's been shown to have some effects on the species use and movement through that area. So obviously a solar panel, for example, or even a wind turbine is not actually taking the bird. The birds are not being killed by those development types, but they are avoiding areas where development of any kind might occur, and especially where it exceeds a certain percentage disturbance on the landscape. So that's just one kind of impact that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, that one, and if I could just jump in, that of course we have a sage grouse mitigation plan in Oregon, and we're not allowed to build solar projects in sage grouse habitat. So I'm wondering about other, I'm having a hard time understanding what an impact could be on migratory birds, for example.
That I do not know.
I can say some of the literature talks about, several, at least hypothetical impacts on avian species. So one of those is just, change in the availability of places to land or, places to forage for food. Some impacts are also, concerns with bird strikes with solar modules, either because, the solar panels have been hypothesized to attract insects to them, or they've been hypothesized to appear to be water or some sort of landing ground that the bird then has a collision with. And I don't think any of those are very well documented at this point. It's certainly something that we have kept an eye out for any evidence or literature on, but I think those are all mostly hypothetical things at this point.
feel like there has been studies done about the quote unquote, having it look like water, and I feel like those have been disproven, but it would be good to know more.
Okay. Well, if there's no comments directly on that, Rachel, you had gotten in line, so please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is Rachel Katz at Tetra Tech. I sort of more broadly, given that folks have been raising wildlife questions, I guess I wanted to ask or point out that there's a whole separate standard and separate analysis that is done for wildlife for applications. So I would think that those kind of issues would be handled under that standard and that analysis, where it's very detailed and involves a lot of effort and resource, field investigations by applicants, and before it went too far down the road of adding additional items in separate exhibits for protected areas, et cetera, would want to see if there actually is any lack in the current analysis that's been provided for wildlife considerations. That seems to be very, very thoroughly covered for applications.
Thanks, Rachel. And I might call on Sarah. She's still on the line, to see if if the proximity to a protected wildlife habitat area, or being placed within an important area for connectivity between protected areas would be considered in or incorporated in the process for categorizing habitat within a facility site boundary.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought there was a comment earlier. I guess, I mean, I think that it depends on the location, but the analysis area for fish and wildlife habitats 5 miles from the site boundary. So I think if the protected areas happen to be overlapping in that buffer, that importance and values of those protected areas would be could be captured in that analysis. Does that make sense? So whether it's a migration corridor, I don't know that would be captured, but the habitat category could be, which involves the species use in those areas. I don't know. Not directly. How about that?
Thanks. I think that's fair. And I think we can do some consultation with our partners at ODF and W2 to see how exactly protected areas play into their own wildlife policy, which is the underlying basis for our standard for wildlife. Okay, I'm seeing Irene and Jimmy have your hands up, and if those are new hands, please go ahead. If those are just your existing hands, I think I'm going to try to put both of them down now. Great. Irene, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
The comment was, as far as application when it comes to wildlife and the wildlife standard, it's true that the study area that's being dealt with is 5 miles, but I can tell you that the actual analysis area is often the site boundary. And I'm thinking about things like, I've been very concerned about things like marshes, because if they're outside the border of the development, they are not addressing them. And you have things like the spotted frog and different threatened and endangered species in these marshes, and they're not dealing with them. And the other comment that I meant to make some point in this is we have a bunch of mitigation sites, and in particular, I think about right now Ladd Marsh, which has both federal mitigation sites for the Columbia River area, and they also have state mitigation sites for ODOT. I believe there's another agency. Those really should be called protected areas because they're not supposed to be impacted in any negative way, and they're not even being identified when it comes to dealing with protected areas. So I would like to see mitigation sites listed, and also I can say pretty specifically and from experience that wildlife impacts, with the exception of, I think sage grouse has a specific standard that talks about indirect impacts. Basically, the elk, there's a management plan that addresses some of the indirect impacts, but by and large, indirect impacts to wildlife are ignored by FSAC in their decision making. So I think they should be included as part of the addressing protected areas. That's it.
Thanks, Irene. Angela, would you like to respond? Or
Just briefly, I don't want to belabor this because I am not a wildlife expert, but I would love more information on these issues being raised because they do seem a little hypothetical. I'm trying to understand how a solar project could have any negative impacts on a marsh that is located outside of the project area, especially for critter like a frog who's probably not going to want to leave that marsh area. So anyways, I mean, I'm glad we're having these conversations, but we have to make decisions based on science and not on kind of hypothetical concerns. So I'm hoping we can keep ourselves grounded in that.
Great. Yeah. And on that point, if anybody has, empirical based studies or designs, thanks so much to Dean, who's already shared the energy landscape study that we'll definitely look into. We will definitely take that into consideration as we're working up our recommendations. This is a pretty open process, and I think we are really attempting to at least make decisions that are strongly supported by empirical evidence to the extent we can. I think it's also fair to say that there are areas which there is a more robust body of evidence than others, and some of these things are, we are making our best attempt. On that note, I think we've actually addressed most of these questions up here. So I'd like to just give an opportunity to anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to share anything they'd like to share about study areas to speak. Otherwise, we can move on. So does anybody have any final thoughts on this issue? Or any of these questions, I should say, before we move on. Okay, well, seeing none, I briefly want to we do have a set of alternatives that we've identified here. We don't have this for every issue that we're talking about today, but I at least thought it would be worthwhile to go over what people have recommended we consider so far. And that is one, that we could make no changes. Two, that we could specifically reduce the study area for protected areas to 10 miles or another distance for all different types of facilities. We've had a recommendation that we reduce the study area for impacts to protected areas, scenic resources, and recreational opportunities to 1 mile for solar facilities. And then we've had the recommendation that we specify that study areas and analysis areas only extend to Oregon borders. I think most of you have given us impact on the pros and cons of most of these. So just quickly, I am wondering if anybody has any additional alternatives you think we should consider, or if there are any of these existing alternatives which are just non-starters and should be eliminated. And we have, again, I think previous impact on or the previous advice that we've heard on these existing ones. Lena?
Yeah, I don't know if I have another suggestion, but I have a question about number 2. Is that reduce the study area to 10 miles for all types of resources, or reduce the protected areas for solar?
I believe that the recommendation that we got was to change the study area from 20 miles to 10 miles for all types of facilities.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right there on the side, for all facilities. Thank you.
Jocelyn?
Thanks, Chris. This is a question as to how the proposals here would work with, I think, the existing rule provision that allows some flexibility in setting a study area. And so I think it's in another division of the rules, there's some flexibility for the council to establish study areas that differ from the sort of standard approach. And so I guess I was just wondering, with the proposals here, or that you're considering, if you would still imagine that the council would want to retain that flexibility to make adjustments, one way or another, depending on the particular circumstances of the project.
Thanks, Jocelyn. So I don't have the rules open, and I could pull them up. So I'm not exactly sure what the ability of folks to propose alternative study areas are, but I can say that there's definitely, the department would establish analysis areas after the NOI has been submitted. Is that maybe what you're thinking of? And that might be, like if we have the preliminary analysis of the study areas, we would say, okay, like we are reducing the analysis area to a smaller size based on this type of facility or the type of resources that are present. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but we can definitely take another stab at it. Elaine, do you have a comment?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I was just going to comment on the study area alternatives, kind of touching on what you and Jocelyn were just talking about the study area versus the analysis area. So are you thinking for this alternative that the study area definition in the OARs could be revised, like under 2, it could decrease 2 or 3, it could decrease the definition of study area for certain facilities? Is that kind of where this concept is going?
That would be, the range of, that would be like what is under consideration is whether that should happen.
Okay.
I think we are looking for input more generally too on, how we should be translating these study areas to analysis areas. But yeah, specifically the recommendations we got was change the study area as defined in the rule.
Okay. Well, one thought is changing the definition of study area for under these standards to reduce the size, and then that would be what was looked at in the NOI. But then if there were comments during the NOI process, or certain concerns that were raised that gave a basis for the department to decide that a greater analysis area was created, then that could be, you know, adopted via findings in the project order and having the analysis extend beyond the study area that was in the NOI. But I definitely think particularly for solar projects, you know, considering an alternative like alternative 3 is a great idea.
Okay, yeah, well, I'm not sure if that was a question, but I will say yes. If there's evidence to suggest that the analysis area should be larger than the study area in the NOI, the current rules do accommodate that. So that wouldn't change. Yeah, and then yeah, we definitely hear your recommendation on the alternatives.
Thanks.
Irene, if you have a comment, please go ahead. Otherwise,
Yeah, and I will shut up here in a minute, but the number 3, talking about 1 mile for solar facilities, I would have a real problem with that because when you're talking about avoidance of an area for wildlife to avoid an area, what you're really talking about is moving wildlife off of what may be very high quality habitat onto less desirable habitat. And in that instance, it actually can end up with really with killing them. And so I really think you need to look at the impacts to them. And one of the places that I've had a lot of problems is with, you know, we have these study areas that may be 20 miles, but then when they come down to an analysis area, the rule talks about significant impacts. Well, there's supposed to be mitigation for indirect impacts. And when you use the word significant impacts and someone is deciding at the Department of Energy that the impacts won't be significant, there is basically no justification there, no criteria for what is significant and what isn't significant. And I have found that developments are being they're being built in areas where there are significant indirect impacts are being ignored. And so I just think it ought to say, if you have impacts, if we're really looking at both direct and indirect impacts, then the analysis areas should look at areas where there is an impact. So that's one of my big concerns. These analysis areas that only include the site boundary are naive at the least. You know, you don't even have a setback from nests or anything else when you talk about the analysis area going right up to the edge of the boundary of the development. The end.
Thanks, Irene. Yeah, and I hope that we can touch on some of the things you just brought up about, you know, how we would look at the analysis of impacts and then make a determination of significance in our next issue too. But yeah, I think that that's definitely a good point to make about how we should be thinking about setting the study areas, and I'll look at those rules as we're moving forward and make a note of that comment as well. Dean? Dean, did you have a comment?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I was accidentally on mute. When I look at the 4 options, they make me a little bit nervous. It looks like 3 of the 4 options would reduce the analysis areas. And I'm specifically concerned about scenic resources. I'm concerned about all resources, but I have expertise in scenic resources only. There's no empirical basis whatsoever for reducing the analysis area when it comes to scenic resources. Most renewable energy projects and, well, other energy projects and transmission lines all have potential impacts that extend out quite a ways from the project area. And so there's just, when you were asking before about empirical evidence, there just isn't any you've already got what, a 10-mile radius, I think, on a project for analysis on visual impacts. 10 miles is already way too small when it comes to certain kinds of projects like wind turbines. It's far too small. For PV collectors, it probably is appropriate. But to think about reducing the analysis area, I think is going in the wrong direction.
Thanks, Dean. Fuji?
Yes, hi. I guess similar to Dean, I just want to say I feel the only one here is number one, unless we have some other alternatives. I feel like we're going in the wrong direction. We're here to protect resources, scenic resources, protected areas. I mean, we're not making more of them. If anything, we're making less of them. And so I feel like just reducing this is not helping matters. If a project does not have an impact, then what's the harm in the study area being larger? I'm sorry, developers, may cost you a little bit more, but let's face it, the area is established because there are impacts. And so to me, reducing that impact area is not the answer. By resource type, I think if I'm saying this right, for example, the solar resources may be something to look at and get some more evidence on. I could see that. You know, if you put a solar farm on top of the whole data farm somewhere, that might have much less impact than that same footprint on prime habitat for sage grouse or for other birds or whatever. So I mean, I think that can be argued then when it comes to that particular resource. But I think the notion of reducing what we already have here, I just don't think that's the right direction to be going in. And I do think we need to look and have study areas beyond Oregon's borders. I didn't mention this earlier. I mean, the legal thing aside, and there may be nothing we can do legally outside of our borders. However, a study area is a study area, and resources and habitats and all that do not correlate with our geopolitical borders. So that's all I have to say there. And I'd like to keep number one, no changes in the study area itself.
Great, thanks, Fuji. And I think that, yeah, you've all given us a lot to think about and look at in this. I will just say that, you know, so what I've heard is that many people think that what we have is appropriate, but that it may be appropriate to adjust specific study areas for specific types of facilities if we have some empirical basis to do that. So my request to you all in the short term would be, if you have any sorts of studies that you would like us to look at in making this determination, please send them over. Otherwise, we will continue our review and determine whether any changes are warranted. Okay, so with that, I think we'll move on to our second topic, which is related, and it's about the methodology for impact analyses. And again, I'm going to point out that this was, again, a issue that was raised by stakeholders during this process. And that is whether the council's rules should provide more specific methods for the evaluation of impacts to scenic resources, recreational opportunities, and protected areas. And I'm actually really glad that some of our federal agency partners here are present, because I know you all may have more experience using some of the specific methodologies we'll be talking about. But basically, the feedback is that our rules require, once we've established those analysis areas, they require the applicant to describe potential impacts to resources within those analysis areas and demonstrate that the proposed facility will not result in significant adverse impacts. Our rules do not at this point require specific methodologies for impact assessments to be used under any of these standards. And we've had some stakeholders raising concerns that this lack of specificity in our rules has led to some inconsistency in findings and sometimes inadequate council findings. And so those stakeholders have recommended that we adopt a specific methodology for visual impacts assessments. For my own benefit, I guess, but also hopefully for yours, I wanted to go through just an example of a kind of generic visual impact assessment. This was taken from a comparison of different assessment methodologies used in various NEPA processes. But basically, the process would start with a facility description of the facility and identification of any facility components that may have the potential for visual impacts. Looking at the analysis area and conducting a viewshed analysis to help identify where the visual impact receptors would be, so where the resources where you could see the facility from are. Doing a key observation point study, identifying the affected activities, viewer characteristics, and view duration, and the landscape character in the potentially affected area. Then looking at, the applicant's proposed mitigation strategies to mitigate any potential impacts, preparing visual simulations, assessing the nature and magnitude of the visual and landscape character impacts based on those simulations and the earlier analysis, and then identifying the significance of those impacts and determining whether any additional mitigation might be needed. And so, like I said, this is just kind of a generic overview of what a full evaluation would look like, and our rules don't necessarily require all of these steps to be met, but most of the visual impact assessments that we receive at least cover some of this process and follow the overall, outline of the process pretty closely, even if sometimes visual simulations might not be included, or a key observation point survey may not always be included. For projects that are on, and I can go back to that slide in a second if anybody wants to see it again. For projects that are on federal lands or have an intersection with federal lands, applicants often use the U.S. Forest Service's Scenery Management System or the BLM Visual Resource Management System. I'm hoping that since we have some folks from those agencies, if there's specific questions about how those systems work, you might all be able to address those. And then we've also had at least some references to the Federal Highway Administration's guidelines for visual impact assessments. That provides, follows a similar outline as those other two systems, but does seem to be a little bit more tiered in the approach and allowing for a more abbreviated review or more extensive review based on the scale and interest in the project. And then we also just wanted to include that somebody had recommended that we look at the Oregon California Trails Association's trail setting classifications manual. And while that manual is really overall more of a resource inventory tool, it does have some good guidance on how to analyze the impacts to visual setting for particularly cultural and historic resources. So these are some of the resources we've already been looking at. In kind of thinking about whether we should require applicants to use one of those systems or maybe a set of those systems, or just identify particular aspects of those systems which could be used, we thought it'd be helpful to kind of list them out. So our discussion questions here, I think we can kind of, again, just maybe address them as you all see fit, but would be one, what are the most important aspects of a visual impact assessment that should be included in the council process? Whether we should be requiring one process or whether there should be differentiation between context, resources, or impacts. And And while we're really focused on visual impacts, we did just want to give folks the opportunity to raise other examples or other methods that we should consider when we're looking at other types of impacts as well. So that's the issue in a nutshell. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer that. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and open the floor to comments. Dean, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a really interesting and big topic, and a lot of people are tackling this issue right now, not just Oregon FSEC. For example, the Forest Service has just started a process to update its system for visual assessment. It's kind of out of date. It was last updated in 1990s. Federal Highways updated their system in 2015. I'm currently working on a handbook for California Department of Transportation so that they can have their own system that somewhat follows federal highways, but then tailors it to state law in California, which includes the CEQA requirements. And I will add that, and then the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management has just completed a handbook for offshore wind, specific to offshore wind, which I think is easily adaptable to other energy projects, including onshore wind. So those are all ones that you should be looking at. The other thing I'll say is, having worked with the FSEC manual a couple of times, not manual exactly, but the rules, it's wholly inadequate. I mean, what you've got right now is really, really inadequate. An example would be on simulations. Simulation technology has changed quite a bit. It's a lot easier to do than it used to be. It's also a lot more exacting in terms of its standards than it used to be. I mean, I'm old enough that we used to do just hand sketches and then wireframe diagrams and then Photoshop. And now we have these simulations that are photorealistic, but they're still very limited in how you can apply them. I would just say for FSEC is this is an issue that you really ought to look at very carefully, probably in panel, a group of 4 or 5 visual resource experts to help you kind of walk through this and find if there is a method that would best fit. A quick recommendation would be the BLM methodology, which I think is highly adaptable, much more so than the Forest Service methodology is. And by the way, I used to work for the Forest Service and used to argue the exact opposite. So I was probably wrong then and I'm right now, or else I was right then and I'm wrong now. I'm not sure which. But one of the things that the BLM has done is they've more consistently upgraded their system, because they've had a lot of energy proposals on BLM lands, and that's kind of forced them to adapt. And there is a manual that they did for the state of Wyoming, which I will offline, I will try to look up the title of and send it to you guys so you can, it's downloadable, it's free, unlike my book, which you would have to actually buy. But the Wyoming manual is really good. It specifically addresses renewable energy projects, and it goes through an entire best management practices. So I'll send information on that along to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. And I believe we may have that manual saved in our records. And if we do, I will make sure that that gets posted along with some of our others.
Yeah, thanks.
Fuji, I think you were next.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And thank you, Dean, for all of that. I think I need to get in touch with you. Chris, you have all those manuals in your records in the B2H contested case if you don't have it in your staff office. I have to say that this is one of the most egregious rules that you guys really, you need to work on this. You need consistency. And even if it has some variability, BLM lands, Forest Service lands, whatever, you also have plenty of federal manuals and methodologies to pick and choose from But my caution is with this is to still be extremely clear, either if you design your own FSEC one, or if it ends up with different land uses to have different ones, but being very, very clear. Because right now, in our personal experience for some of us who have been involved in this transmission siting with the Boardman-Hemingway transmission, and the problems that we have faced is that the developers cherry-picked it comes up with a methodology because you don't have a methodology, even though it's supposed to be sufficient specificity, blah, blah, blah. There's no specificity in these rules. Therefore, they can pick whatever they want and make a methodology. So it looks all great, all very, all this picking this from this one and coming up with the methodology. The problem is they cherry picked it and have stuff from the Forest Service from the 1970s, not even using the 1991 or 1994 version, the BLM, the older manual, not the newer one, and on and on and on. And what I just have to say with all of this is that it just becomes totally meaningless. It's not up to date. Right now, the visual assessments that are being used are like you're driving in your car and you pull over to the way station and you look out once and you have one viewpoint. That's a key observation point. That's it. Nothing about, as 1994 Forest Service manual talks about, and in your NEPA little diagram too, that landscape characteristic. I mean, what are we doing in recreation areas nowadays? Riding bikes, we're taking hikes, whatever. What is the experience? What is the characteristic of it? It isn't just looking at it from some simple viewpoint with a peripheral view, maybe. The whole scenic and recreation standard, in particular when it comes to visual, I mean, you might as well not have a rule. You guys really need to not hammer this out. There are a lot of good federal resources. That Wyoming manual is excellent. The Forest Service work is excellent. And those need to be updated and part of your process. And I like what Dean is saying, and I'll provide you the resources as well, but there'll be duplicates of Dean's, I think. But this needs to be shored up. That's all I have to say for right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Fuji. Meg, you had your hand up next.
Hi there. I agree with what Dean and Fuji have been saying, and I just wanted to put in a plug as well for what I believe is the Argonne National Laboratory's visual impact assessment that may be part of the Wyoming study that's been mentioned, and somebody else may have more information than I do, but I believe it's Argonne National Laboratory.
Yeah, this is Dean, and Argonne did write that Wyoming manual.
Great. Yeah, so I would just refer to that as well. And I think, that the second question there regarding if the methods should be different for the different contexts, like, yeah, I do think that there should be some flexibility in how these things are looked at, as opposed to saying, this is the only way to do it. Rather, as these people mentioned, these different visual impact methodologies do have their different strengths. So if only we had the most perfect one that combined everything, a pipe dream there. But yeah, I think that there are these different approaches, and all of them do have their different strengths. Thank you.
Thanks. Irene?
Hi. Okay, I support what's been said so far, but a few specifics here. I've heard multiple times at FSAC meetings that there are no specific requirements for protected areas, and it's up to council discretion what they decide. So when you add that to the use of the word significant impacts, and significant impacts have been things like building a wind turbine within a quarter of a mile of a wild and scenic river where you can see the wind turbines from the water. It's been things like building a wind turbine, and I've dealt a lot with wind turbine, within 50 feet of Oregon Trail ruts has been one proposed site certificate. What is significant? And I know there's a definition of significant, but I can tell you the application of that term is bizarre at times. The other thing is the use of key observation points. What they're doing with that is using where do the most people show up? that's a really inappropriate way to evaluate something like a wild and scenic river or Oregon Trail areas. You know, where when you're talking about a natural environment or a natural setting, going to where all the people are going to be is not an appropriate approach to looking at scenic values. Let's see, what else did I wrote down here? Right down here. I think that there needs to be a specific process, and it needs to delineate exactly. It needs to be measurable. There's so much right now that is just subjective evaluation, and there really is no criteria for scenic issues. I like the U.S. Forest Service information. I like the BLM information, and actually, one thing I like in the OCTA is they define if a structure is within a certain distance of a resource, it's considered a high impact. And what I'm thinking of when I say that, I think there needs to be some distance specification. Building a transmission line within 127 miles of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center is being considered as not a significant impact. We need to do away with that kind of thing, that kind of thinking. Anyway, those are my comments. And I agree with everyone who says this rule is non-existent right now in terms of the way it's being applied.
Yeah, I would say that so far it is safe to say that we've heard that most of you do seem to, or most of the people at least that I've shared, do agree that we need some sort of method. And I'm wondering if we can hear from anybody, maybe some of the energy developers or people that prepare applications about, you know, if one of these, if either we'll say that the Forest Service or the BLM methodologies would be more appropriate or are more commonly used for energy development, or if there would be any concerns about the council mandating use of one of those methodologies or adapting one of those methodologies for use in the FSEC process. And maybe while you're thinking about that, Fuji, I did see that your hand was back up, so go ahead.
Okay, while folks are thinking about that, I just want to correct Irene. It wasn't 125 miles from the interpretive center. It's 125 feet. It's just, that's okay. I think if there was to be still some variability in the methods, I'm not comfortable really with that, but that at a minimum, they should stay the most updated manual. When I'm talking about cherry picking, I'm talking about, you know, things like, I'll just say it, Idaho Power has used in the Boardman-Hemingway analysis. So we'll go for 1974 in the Forest Service, we'll go to 1976, 86 in the BLM, blah, blah, blah. So it needs to be the most updated if you're going to use those resources. And then this term of significant, as Irene is talking about, even if you use, or the BLMs, and you have high impact, high impact, high impact, high impact, and then Odo comes out for no significant impact. How can you come up with no significant impact when all the other metrics have said high impact? So I think that it's really difficult because scenic is a subjective thing. Maybe Dean can help us a bit with this, but I think that there needs to possibly be some kind of a panel or some kind of independent look at those analysis. Let's face it, Odo, who's doing the review and putting out the draft proposed order and proposed orders, are being paid by the developers. We know this. There seems to be an inherent problem in this whole process. So if there can be some little independent of something to look at the data and say, okay, what's the conclusion? Rather than the conclusion being, oh, no significant impact, almost 100% of the time, then, you know, I think that might add a little validity to the process. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. You guys know this is a hot topic for me. Sorry if I'm ranting. Here you go.
Yeah, this is Dean again. I have been having trouble getting my hand up again. I thought I had solved the problem, and now it's not helping me. But anyway,
no problem. Go ahead, Dean.
I work both sides of the fence. Currently, I'm working for developers who are trying to develop offshore wind on the East Coast. And I have worked for developers in Oregon as well. I've also worked for the opposition on projects. So I'm not here as an advocate for anything in particular, just for a good process. You know, having said that, there are some things that you can work on. I'm talking about FSEC to really improve things. And one of the areas that I think should be looked at is it's a really important clause that you have that says if there is, I don't know if I'm going to get the terminology right, but if there is a significant adverse impact on visual resources, you don't leave yourself any out. The project has to be turned down, just on that basis alone. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, it would. Well, there is a method through which we could do what's called a balancing determination, and I think it applies to at least some of these standards.
Well, one of the issues that I've encountered is that because of that particular standard, it makes it difficult for a developer and their consultant to do a fully thorough, honest assessment of visual impacts. Because if they do and they find it's significantly adverse, they're kind of derailing their project. And you need some kind of out clause that allows mitigation to happen, including offsite mitigation, including payments to the community or the people affected. You need a way to allow for a more honest assessment that's not deliberately kind of downplaying the impacts. That's one thing. The other thing is, was it Fuji, I think, was saying that having some sort of independent assessment, particularly in any kind of controversial project, I think is really important to be able to pull in one or two outside experts who aren't paid by the developer, who are not paid by advocates who are trying to stop the project, and have them come in and take a look and see if the assessment was done properly and see if the findings are defensible. Might be a good process for FSEC to consider. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. And I will just make one point to address that. I should have said mitigation can be considered when we're making our final determination of significance. And that would usually include things like siting conditions to eliminate facility components from certain areas, or design conditions to use, design features that are more visually subordinate. But that does vary significantly from project.
But there are going to be times and places where you are unable to mitigate a project down to something below significantly adverse. These projects are big.
Yeah.
They take up a lot of space. They're seen from a lot of areas, and so I'm just saying that you can't rely on that clause that you're going to be able to mitigate your way out of it. You might not be able to mitigate your way out of it, but you don't want it to be a make or break for the entire project. You want to be able to still approve the project, but find other ways to compensate for the problems that it creates.
Great, thanks, Dean. Jocelyn?
Thanks, Chris. This is Jocelyn Pease, outside counsel with Idaho Power. And I just wanted to respond to your request, Chris, for a developer perspective. And I'd note also that a number of folks on the line today have raised some specific criticisms of the B2H process, and I don't intend to get into all of that here in this setting. I don't think that's really appropriate for this discussion, but would add that
thank you for that, Jocelyn.
When Idaho Power was approaching developing a methodology, initially, my understanding is that initially they had used one of the federal methodologies, and the feedback from Odo was that that methodology didn't adequately account for what the council focuses on, which is the definition of significant in the council's rules. And so I think that that's one thing to be mindful of in looking sort of outside at federal methodologies, is how that fits back in with what the council's looking at. And I mean, I don't have our visual resources expert on with me today to weigh in about the various methodologies that are out there. But I guess I would say another consideration that was relevant for B2H as well is looking at a large scale linear facility where you're crossing multiple land management jurisdictions, including both BLM and Forest Service, and trying to come up with an approach for evaluating resources that are under those different management jurisdictions. So I just offer those general comments, and if there's anything specific that you were looking for, Chris, as far as input, I could see if I could help out with that.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, no, I think I was just looking for general feedback there, but I think what you raised is very, very helpful. And I think we're probably about ready for a break. So to kind of recap, is that we've heard a lot that we definitely need to have some methodology and or maybe a menu of methodologies that are accepted for the council process, but at least something so that there's some meaningful clarity in what is required. And then Jocelyn, I think what you just kind of brought up, and maybe this is consistent with what Irene was saying, was that if we are going to specify a methodology be used, that we should also be using that methodology's determination of significance, and maybe make sure that we're not circling back around to the council's rule and kind of overriding something, or at least confusing the issue of what that term means. Which I think is very, very good feedback, and something that we'll have to look at carefully, because I don't know if that's something that we had considered previously. And it looks like Angela you have your hand up, so I'll give you the last one.
Yeah, thanks. I just briefly, I like what you just said about a menu of options. I think that's especially important since different resources have very different types of visual impacts. So I like that menu idea. Thanks.
Great. Well, with that, thanks again. I think that was very, very productive, and we got a lot of good impact there, and definitely have some homework to do on this question. Our next two issues, again, are related to the identification of resources. So let's come back and start talking through those. And does a 10-minute break sound okay to everybody? I'll just assume you're all shaking your heads. So let's reconvene maybe in 10 minutes. That would be 5 till 3 o'clock.
Okay. We're recording.
Great, and it looks like it's just about time. So hopefully most folks are back. That's a freak. My presentation again. Okay. So welcome back. Hopefully you all were able to stretch out and get a drink of water before we start our discussion of our next issue, which is whether applicants should be required to review state land management plans when identifying significant or important scenic resources. So the current scenic resources standard protects scenic resources and values identified as significant or important in local land use plans, tribal management plans, and federal land management plans. And analysis is required for impacts to those resources. There are some state land management plans which establish scenic corridors and bikeways and some other scenic resources that are not currently included in the rule, but are generally still reviewed for impacts. So we are asking specifically whether or not those state management plans should be included. We've also had a comment from, or recommendation from one stakeholder that regional and interstate plans, such as the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area Management Plan, should be included in the rule. So we'd appreciate any feedback on that recommendation. And then a few folks have questioned whether or not the basis for using land management plans as the basis for the rules is appropriate at all. So in our discussion questions for this particular issue, we have 3 questions that we kind of like some input on. One, whether scenic resources, whether there is any input on the recommendation to include state, regional, and interstate plans in the standard. 2, if land management plans are the best way to identify significant and important scenic resources, or if there's some other way we could go about identifying those types of resources. And then 3, what role reviewing agencies and the public should play in the identification of significant and important resources, whether that should be limited to identifying the appropriate plans and the resources in there, or there should be some sort of maybe nomination process for people to identify other plans that are not included in a land management plan. Sorry, other resources not included in a land management plan. So I'll go ahead and look to the group to see if anybody has any input or ideas that they'd like to start us off with. Nick. And Nick, I don't think you've spoken yet, so if you could introduce yourself too, that would be appreciated.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, no, I have not spoken yet. I'm a regional planner for the U.S. Forest Service, covering the states of Oregon and Washington. And I just wanted to home in a bit on what you stated with regard to the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Management Plan. To my mind, that is a federal land management plan. So just wanted to highlight that it's authorized under the National Scenic Area Act. So could you say a bit more about what the question is with regard to that?
Sure. Yeah, our analysis is also that that is a federal plan, or for the aspects of the plan that are adopted under the bi-state kind of management agreement, that it would be a state plan. And we just had one stakeholder say that for the purpose of clarity, they think the word interstate should be included in the rule. And so, yeah, we appreciate feedback on whether or not that is necessary for that particular plan, or if there's other types of plans. that should be thought about as interstate.
Understood. Yep. Thanks. That it does seem like a good suggestion to me. Would probably want to take a closer look at some of the legal language around that, just to make sure that it's captured in whatever final rules are put forward. But yes, that does seem like a good recommendation to me.
Thanks. Susan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Hi, yeah, we can hear you, but you're pretty quiet.
Yeah, hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I had a concern for, I mean, it seems like there really is a lot of situations where there are scenic areas or that are not covered by land management plans, and especially privately owned natural areas or other scenic areas. So I do have a concern about how those should be captured somehow.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, and for clarification, our belief is that the standard was originally intended to capture, what is known as Goal 5 resources in the local land use management system. And so sometimes things that are not publicly available would not be considered a scenic resource because these are, talking about public resources. But there is also, it is true that not all counties have completed their Goal 5 inventories. So we recognize that there may be some uninventoried or designated scenic resources out there. And if there's specific recommendations on how we can go about identifying those and maybe making the determination of whether those are significant or important, like that is something we definitely would like to hear.
Yeah. Well, another thing that comes to mind is land trusts that have acquired certain lands in part because of their scenic resources. So I guess you're saying it's up to counties to decide how scenic they are?
I'm saying in the current process, that is kind of how it has worked. But if there are good ways that we can go about identifying those land trust areas and evaluating, their significance, we're open to hearing recommendations.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to recommend, but it just seems like there ought to be a way to take those into account.
Great, thanks. And that's something we can definitely poke around a little bit for more, but let's see if anybody else has any ideas. Angela.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the private lands issue. It's really difficult for us to know where those private special areas on private lands are because they're not necessarily reported anywhere. There's not an inventory. There's nowhere to go to find out what those are. And so we would recommend not including private lands.
Great. And for clarification, I mean, I do think there are some instances where, private lands, like lands owned by the Nature Conservancy or a land trust, have that kind of public aspect. And they might even be included in a land use inventory. But I think I hear what you're saying is maybe if it's just, a private landowner's personal property, that's not something we should consider.
Well, some of these areas are available to the public for use. And that's part of why they've acquired them, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah. And I think to your point, Susan, I'm saying something like, I think Cascade Head is technically private land, or parts of it are, but I think we all recognize that as a scenic resource for the parts of it that aren't. Okay, I guess moving on, Dean.
Yeah, a couple of things, Chris. One is that, excuse me, the Forest Service and the BLM, which together I think have about 55% of the state of Oregon, they have gone through inventory processes where they've inventoried scenic resources, identified them, and then carried it through a process to decide what level of protection they give, which can be anything from preservation down to modification, which allows quite a bit of development, such as large-scale energy projects. The rest of the state, the other 45%, which is not owned by Forest Service or BLM, has done no such process. Only, I think, 3 counties in Oregon have done scenic inventories. One was, in fact, I'm not even sure if it's 3 counties. I know Deschutes County did a number of years ago. Some cities have done it. Ashland has done it. Bandon, Oregon has done it. Portland, Oregon has done it, but very few cities have done it. So, when we look at this question about state, regional, and let's call it local plans as well, we're not going to find much there. Nobody's going to find much because they haven't bothered to do that kind of inventory. So what I suggest is that the FSEC should require developers, when they're doing their visual analysis, they should identify scenic resources that are designated, but also scenic resources that have not been designated. And that can be mountains, rock outcrops, sections of rivers, sagebrush, steppe landscapes. I mean, there's a lot of nature out there that is in private hands. Now, the process is not going to force those landowners to protect it necessarily, but it is going to take into account those resources within the decision making of how much development gets done within a given area. And so this idea of relying on already designated resources, I think, is one of the real weak spots in the whole FSEC process, frankly. It doesn't work very well. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. And just for clarification, would you recommend that there be some sort of criteria or like specific things that would need to be inventoried, or that an applicant would need to do some sort of comprehensive landscape inventory?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of work that's been done on this. Particularly the BLM has done a lot of work to identify what it is that people find scenic. Undisturbed natural vegetation, complex topography, seasonal color, landscapes with seasonal color, anything with water features. They've got a pretty good list. I think it's about 6 things that you would look for. And if those things exist out there, they are scenic. They should be identified as scenic resources within the inventory, and they should be considered in the plan. Yeah, it's not looking for a needle in a haystack. The haystack's right there out there in front of you.
Great. Yeah, we will. I'll try to look up that BLM inventory process, but thanks so much for that.
I'll send you a reference.
Great. Yeah, appreciate it. Brian?
Hi, I just want to, these are some great points that Dean and Susan just made. And I guess I'd put out the perspective that, the BLM Forest Service lands were created for the most part 100 years or so ago. And so we're looking at a shrinking amount of protected landscape out there. And, to Susan's point, a more recent way of protecting landscape has been in the conservation easement and land trust sort of arena. And, you know, these, yeah, they probably could be more categorized, and maybe there's a directory out there, but I don't think it's too heavy of a lift to go out and find these areas and do a reasonable amount of protection for these areas. As was mentioned, some of them are open to the public to varying degrees, but they're also these conservation easements and land trust protections were created to protect the resource. And so I would advocate that FSEC do the effort to protect them in the face of potential future development. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Angela, I think you had your hand up next.
Yeah, thank you. So I believe there's a process already in place for designating scenic areas and protected areas. And I mean, you know, this process is a facility siting process. It's not a process by which new scenic areas are designated. So, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of what folks say, and there's definitely validity to that. But, you know, we'll pick on the Nature Conservancy since we keep talking about them. If they have land that they or others feel like should be a scenic area and designated as such, then it feels like they should go through that process, because there is a process that already exists to create those designations. So, you know, I think this is not really the appropriate place to be creating new designations. And from the conversation, it feels a little bit like we're kind of creeping into that territory.
Thanks, Angela. And to clarify, I think there should be a distinction made between a formally designated scenic area, which is protected under the protected area standard, and a scenic resource, which is protected under the scenic resources standard, and that those scenic resources don't necessarily need to be designated under any formal designation. It's just under the current rule, they would need to be like inventoried in a local land use management plan, which is a slightly different process than formal designation. But I think your point is still Irene and then Fuji, I think are next. And I'm gonna
Now can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Counties have very different qualities of their land use plans and designation of scenic resources. For instance, in Union County, we're relying on the original, 1978 land use plan. I can give you an example. Morgan Lake Park is a city designated area for its scenic and noise, lack of noise, that kind of thing. But it's not being treated as protected because the county in their plan doesn't show it as important scenic resource. So one of my concerns with these kinds of areas is there's no place where the public actually has an opportunity to weigh in on these. And it would seem to me that in a draft proposed order stage, when you have many private citizens commenting on an area as having important scenic or important values to the community, that ought to somehow be factored in. And the other thing I was going to say is, when I look at things like this transmission line coming up, I think there ought to be somewhere in this where if an area meets the criteria for designation as a scenic or protected area, then it feels criminal to have a developer be able to take away the criteria that would allow that area to be protected. And so when you're talking about things like the Oregon Trail or historic resources, and there are specific criteria that currently the site definitely meets the criteria, and then you bring in something like a transmission line or a wind farm or solar farm or something that changes the whole environment to the extent that the area no longer meet the standards to be protected. So then it's totally free game as far as the destruction of the resource. So I think it's important that we look at the fact that when we have these pristine areas, whether or not they've gone through the process yet, if they meet all the criteria, that's an important thing to look at and not allow any development that's going to preclude any future protection. And that's what is occurring in many areas, actually. So I'd like to see you look at not only the counties in particular because of the age of a lot of the county rules and land use plans, but when you have a city like LeGrand that specifically identified an area as important and significant to them, that ought to be important whether or not the county saw fit to include that resource in the county plan. Let's see. I guess those are the main things that I have to say. Like I say, I'm really troubled when we take an area that's pristine and make it not pristine just because it doesn't have a piece of paper. Thanks.
Thanks, Irene.
The end.
Fuji, I see. I'm gonna unmute you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Chris, I thought you called on someone else first.
Oh,
This
no,
is
go
Fuji.
ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I want to reiterate what Irene just mentioned. I think it's very important, and it's just a conundrum for you guys. I'm not sure the whole resolution to this. However, the problem is the system is broken. The land use plan regulations and back in the 70s, I mean, these things should have been designated by counties. They're supposed to be kept up, and they're not, and et cetera, et cetera. So it is a real conundrum because you have disparate groups that are, you got the land trusts and all them, they're doing their thing. It's not like I'm not talking about creating new protected areas, but they have their methods and then they have their list. And then there's other people that have their list, the counties, whether they're updated or not, cities updated or not. How do you really know what is a list to use? So it's really difficult. And I don't know if you guys really could even fix that or should even bother because it's not within your realm. But if you do have a problem. So how to solve that problem seems that it may need to be more of a process driven than an actual standards driven, whereby, as Irene mentions and others say, the people know the best. And where are the people in this process of identifying that resource? If you wait all the way to the DPO phase, it's somewhat problematic, I think, for the developer, although you could make sure that everything was covered in that phase. If new things are brought up, then those have to go back and get looked at, or this needs to be something a little earlier. Doing something earlier is difficult, I know, but maybe that's what needs to happen. And I think that, we can identify a lot of places that can give input, but the people are the most important. And a sector that I think has been left out that's very connected to this that I think might help, and I'll just throw this, I don't have the answer, Chris, I guess, but Travel Oregon, the whole tourism sector, chambers of commerce, the chambers of commerce, they know their resources in their counties. They advertise them on their websites and all. So I think that whole tourism area and recreation and scenic go hand in hand, and that we're not even talking about them. We're just talking about the land management agencies, I think is somewhat, missing a whole sector. So I'll just put, and then Jim has arrived because Jim Kreider, he's joined He was out dealing with a septic issue earlier, but he has a comment he'd like to make. Here he is.
Just on the conservation areas, I believe they get tax breaks and they have to comply with certain conditions that the state or the feds give to them. So I would think that might be a database that could also be looked at and scanned for information about protected areas, land trusts, easement, those types of things. So that might be another tool that's not in the toolbox that could be used.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Becky?
Hi, thanks. I work for the Forest Service on National Scenic and Historic Trails, and I may be jumping ahead to the next issue, but since we're talking about scenic resources, it appeared to me that perhaps National Scenic Trails might not be reflected in the list of protected areas, and so I'm wondering if and how they're captured here as scenic resources. And one thing that came to mind in thinking about this first question is that a national scenic trail like the PCT, being the one we have in Oregon, does, it is reflected in federal land management plans, but those are often only, in a sense, for the components that are on federal lands. There is a comprehensive plan that is trail-wide, and I'm not sure that that would be captured here, but I did want to note that the PCT is a pretty, I think, important and beloved scenic resource. It includes some non-federal lands as well, and I just want to be sure that that we know if and how that would be caught by the current standard.
Yeah, it's hard to say if, and I would have to double check to see if that particular comprehensive plan would qualify as a federal plan under this rule, although I imagine it would. As far as determining that that's a scenic resource and an important recreation opportunity, which recreational opportunities are identified in a slightly different way, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then I also wanted to point out that probably parts of the trail that are on federal lands and included in some sort of like national recreation area or national scenic area would be protected under the protected area standard as well. So yeah, we kind of have these three categories of protected areas, scenic resources, and recreation opportunities that are all defined slightly differently and but all protected in some of the same ways. So. I hope that makes sense. While we're on this topic, we did have a recommendation at our last meeting. I think that national trails in general be considered protected areas, or at least specific components be considered protected areas. And if there is any feedback or recommendation anybody has on that, we'd be happy to hear that as part of this discussion.
Are you soliciting that now, or would you like to hear, would you like to discuss it in the next issue?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, if you have.
Yeah, I'm mostly just in listening mode today, but I just wanted to note that for National Scenic Trails and National Historic Trails, they are congressionally designated areas. So if that comes into play, then I think it's important to note that kind of special aspect about the National Trails system.
This is Meg here. May I chime in as well?
Yeah, Meg, go ahead, and then Susan.
Great. Just piggybacking on what Becky said, that yeah, they are all congressionally designated trail corridors, and it's complicated in that they do cross over so many different land jurisdictions, and thus fall under different land management plans. Yeah, a whole slew of different things, and of course they also cross over private land, and thus we don't have any real say over what happens on the private land. And so my office, which is based in Utah and in New Mexico, we administer 9 National Historic Trails, including the Oregon Trail, which goes through your beautiful state, as well as the California National Historic Trail. And it's interesting, our office administers but doesn't manage any of the land, which makes it even more complicated. And so it is through all these partnerships that decisions are made ultimately on the NHTs there. And I guess Laura Roselle brought this up to us, and Becky and Chris and I were on a meeting, I think it was last week. And the question is, what portions of these trails should be protected? And it's such like a squirrely question in many ways. And I think sort of the conversation ended up moving towards talking about high potential historic sites and high potential route segments, which are defined in the National Trail Systems Act, largely that they are parts of the trails that really convey the historic significance of these NHTs. And so the conversation that we had that Laura led sort of focused on that, and sort of, sorry, I'm attempting to think back at what our conversation entailed. And so we discussed sort of how could these high potential route segments be protected primarily. So that was sort of a conversation that we had, but again, it's complicated in that they do cross over so many different land jurisdictions. I hope that makes sense. And Becky and Chris, please feel free to chime in.
Thanks, Meg. I was just going to write a note. Great summary of our conversation. Just for the group, as Meg said, those high potential sites and segments that that we were talking about are specific just to the National Historic Trails, and so there's no real equivalent for National Scenic Trails. So I just wanted to be sure to note that. Both of those trails are congressionally designated and part of the National Trail System, but they do have their own wrinkles.
Great, thanks you all. Thanks to both of you. And yeah, as Meg mentioned, that unraveling the sort of trails designation component and how it would relate to our protected area standard has been pretty tricky. So we'll probably be in touch with you more about that as this process goes on. But we appreciate you bringing that up today. Okay, Susan, sorry to make you wait there.
Oh, yeah, I still feel like, maybe the Nature Conservancy is a big enough organization that they have the time and resources to go through the process of figuring out how to get designated as a scenic or protected area. But I think some of these other land trusts aren't even aware of these issues, and they're, stretched so thin with the issues they have right in front of them that they don't realize what implications these rulemakings have for their land. But I think that the primary reason that a lot of them are that the conservation easements or the ownerships that they have are in place is because of those very reasons. So I really think that EFSC should make a big effort to find out where those lands are and make them protected and scenic areas. That's pretty much it.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, and I think, in some ways, the recommendation that Dean made to do some sort of landscape characterization or inventory tool would accomplish that. But again, not exactly sure how that would look in our process. So I think definitely more work to be done on our end there. On that note, Dean, I see your hand is up. I'm not sure if it's still up. Or if you had another comment?
Yeah, it's still up. So I sent along a reference to a BLM 1986 document. I know it's dated, but it's still pretty useful. It's how to conduct a visual resource inventory. It's like an instruction manual for their own staff on BLM land. So it's it isn't necessarily universally applicable, but I think it's pretty close. It covers certainly most of Oregon's terrain. And I just to clarify, when I was saying that an inventory should be done, I was not implying that just because it's inventoried, it ought to be protected. I think that's a different level of decision. But I think we should know what it is that we have out there as part of our decision-making process. We should know what resources we're potentially going to lose or compromise if we go ahead with this particular project. Thanks.
Thanks. Fuji?
Yes, I just wanted to input there when we were talking about the trails, the long distance trails, the National Historic Trails, and to not lock ourselves into only the National Historic Trails, but also we have new regional trails, long distance, like through trails, such as the Oregon Desert Trail and now the Blue Mountain Trail. So these are, it's kind of a new trendy thing, just like over in Europe, where we have long distance trails. They go through towns, they go through scenic areas and all that. That's a whole new arena, possibly, and I just don't want it. I just want to put it on your radar, Chris, and needs to be looked at. And then this is more of a question than anything else. And if Megan and Becky can't answer it now, that's okay. But I'm curious with the National Historic Trails, such as the National Historic Oregon Trail, which is part of that act as well. What types of protections really exist there? Because we have some of the best parts of the Oregon Trail here in Oregon, but I still see things developed. And when you talk about protecting, and then the standard is the viewshed of the 10 miles or 20 miles, it doesn't seem like it's really matters what the law says. So that's more of a question, I guess, for them for the future. I don't know if you have time now, but anyway, that's all I have to say on the trails, Chris, is to know that they're not just national trails. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Fuji. Yeah, in the interest of time, I will go ahead and go to Nick.
Yeah, thanks. I also just wanted to build on what Becky and others had shared with regard to trail systems and some of the complexities involved in distinguishing between historic and scenic trails and the values we're trying to protect for each. Just reflecting on the bullets you have on the screen here, I would certainly say that land management plans are a great way to identify significant and important scenic resources, but they're not necessarily the only way. Each of these designated trails has its own comprehensive management plan. Same goes for our wild and scenic river corridors, for instance. And so there are layers of different management plans that are more specific than our overarching land and resource management plans that guide the management of an overall national forest, say. So I just wanted to make that point. You know, on the third bullet there, the role reviewing agency should play. It just seems to me that given that complexity, a more consultative stance between the state and federal agencies, rather than just having the state review our written documentation, to invite us in for a sit down so we can help you all identify what those various applicable management plans are, and what specific resources we have interest in protecting scenic values for. So I just wanted to raise that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and at previous meetings, we did discuss, you know, ways to improve at least opportunities for consultation with federal agencies, or at least provide notice of when there is a proposed project in the vicinity of something that's designated as a protected area. So that's something we're also looking at, but I think that is a good reminder now too, that notification and ongoing consultation are important. I think David was next.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I just wanted to put out there a couple of just notes of caution about moving away from relying on, you know, state, regional, and other plans to, and in identifying what resources should be protected under the scenic resources standard. The first being is that, you know, and I think some of the federal entities here identified it, that a lot of these resources are recognized for different types of values, even though whatever their name might be, they may be designated for, you know, scenic or other resources. And the plans are really the best way to identify those. Not only because, well, first off, because they're done, that's done through a very public process where there's public input. The more we move away from that, like from and into just us on this call, on this worksheet, identifying what resources should be considered protected scenic resources, you move away from that public input from those folks that are most impacted by it. The people that live there that could or should, or however you want to describe it, designate it under their state, city, regional plan. I know I've heard some concerns about people upset that certain resources haven't been included or recognized in their plan, but that's only half of the story. There's a process to do that, and the community has decided not to. And I think that's what I'd caution you about us trying to decide that, oh no, we know better than the local community, we know better than the planning processes, and we're just going to pick and choose here today. And the second note of caution I'd provide is, as you move further into like private property designations, even the conservation banks or conservation properties, the conservation easements, there are inventories out there, but they're not absolute. And the only way you can identify a lot of these conservation easements is to do a title search on actual property. And while that may not be a big lift for a discrete facility of 20, 30 acres, but on a large linear project that crosses multiple counties, that becomes a big lift, and it's expensive and it's time consuming, and it's just a big lift to identify something that may or may not be significant. And I can also tell you, within those conservation easements, they're not blanket protections against development. There's often exceptions that allow for some development that, if we just put them all into this bucket, wouldn't recognize what they're actually being protected for. And that goes back to my point about the significance of having them go through a formal process of being part of a planning where people can talk about that. And if a conservation easement holder wants to get their property designated as a protected area under some regulatory scheme, they can do that. But absent that, no one has any input except for that landowner at this point in time, or you, me, and everyone else on this call. So I understand the interest, but I also understand that there is a process for them to expand the scope of this standard. And I'd caution about just jumping forward without really thinking it through.
Thanks, David. Angela?
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of comments in terms of trails. So I'm an avid hiker, and I have been on lots of trails where it may be a really fantastic trail overall, but there are parts of the trail that are not fantastic or scenic or beautiful. but you know, trails are long, and the same issue pops up with scenic byways, which are also very long. And not every part of that scenic byway is scenic by anyone's standard. And so I think when we're talking about areas that are large, like a trail or a scenic byway, I think we need to figure out some way to protect the scenic parts, but allow for development on the parts that are not the scenic parts. So I think we should look for a way to thread that needle. And then my other point is about, you know, when we're talking about trying to figure out other scenic areas that are not on a list somewhere, using a set of criteria instead, that to me is a whole new process that has a lot of subjectivity to it. And it sounds like it would take a really long time to figure that out. So, you know, if a study includes, well, if there's criteria and then, you know, in the process we're arguing about the criteria and is this scenic or is this not scenic, we're in a climate crisis and we feel it every year more and more. We don't have time to be arguing about, you know, is this scenic or not scenic? Does this fit the criteria or not? We need a list to comply with so that we're protecting our special areas now, but that we're protecting our special areas in the future from climate change and all of the horrible impacts that we're already seeing.
Great, thanks, Angela. Irene?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this issue relates to the fact that, you know, under NEPA, there can be these negotiated agreements with the state where in the NEPA review, they do not do an assessment of like the historic properties and viewscapes of those. And I believe that if BLM is going to be doing these agreements, we really need to look at having FSAC standards that are reasonably consistent with what BLM would require. I'm really concerned because when it comes to FSAC, their process means that they don't have to identify even what the impacts are going to be. They say there are going to be impacts. That's all they have to say to get a site certificate. And they list a bunch of potential things that they might do to mitigate because of these impacts that the public doesn't know what they are. The public never sees what the final analysis is as far as what the impacts are, what the mitigation is going to be. And as a result, you have Odo, and which we've already determined, Odo gets paid by the developers. And I mean, your salary comes directly from the developers. And so if we don't have some kind of third party looking at these issues, to me, it's very inappropriate for FSAC to be evaluating for a NEPA process if they don't have some kind of criteria that in some way relates to what NEPA would require. As I see it, at least with the BLM line, somebody needs to require BLM to do their own analysis because it's not being done by the state. So anyway, that's my comment and a serious concern. I'd like to know who you turn that over to as far as a complaint, I guess, because the process is so dissimilar. And like we've already said, the FSAC process for protected areas basically doesn't exist. So the end.
Thanks, Irene. And just because there's been several comments about the funding mechanism for this agency, I will say that that's not something that we can address through rulemaking. That's probably not a surprise. Yeah, I will let, I think also, you know, what federal agency requirements are what federal agencies are required to do. It's also something that's outside of the scope of issues I can address, but or we can address through rulemaking. But yeah, thank you for that, Irene. I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna have looks like Rachel has her hands up and Dean, and then we'll move on to our final issue about recreation opportunities.
Hi, thank you. This is Rachel again. I wanted to just echo briefly David and Angela's comments, just that I agree it would be a pretty significant shift to go from important scenic resources that are identified by existing public processes to it being an applicant responsibility on a project by project basis. That seems like shifting a sizable burden without, as Angela said, a clear process or way to do that in a reasonable way and timeline. And also trying to include public input, I would encourage a way that goes back to thinking about how, if they need support, just alternative ways that the existing processes can be supported to identify those resources.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Dean, do you want the last word on this topic?
Absolutely. I always love having the last word. They always say first word or the last word, you know, and the last word is even better. Back to the question on inventory. Forest Service and BLM, like I mentioned, have these inventory methods. One of the nice things about those methods is they break landscapes into roughly 3 categories, A, B, and C. We often call them A, B, and C. A being deserving of the highest level of protection, C being deserving of virtually no protection or very low level of protection. Scenically, it may have other resources that are worth protecting. And then B being something in between. And I think my experience has been so far that most of the energy proposals in Oregon are happening on either C or B type landscapes, not on the A landscapes. The A landscapes are pretty well protected. That would include places like the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area. However, we get encroachment on the boundaries of the scenic area and within the viewshed of the scenic area. There are projects that have placed wind turbines, for example, you know, right on the boundary of the National Scenic Area where they're in clear view from within the National Scenic Area. So the kind of inventory that I'm suggesting is not endless, it's not time consuming, and it's not without purpose. And I actually think it would facilitate development of renewable energy in Oregon as opposed to making it more difficult. And the reason is because it would set out clear standards. A landscapes, you wouldn't build in those. Everybody knows that already. You're not going to build a wind energy project or a solar energy project on the slopes of Mount Hood, for example. C landscapes should be given more or less a green light from a scenic standpoint. So if we had a good inventory, it's a C landscape, then you're not going to have much opposition based on scenery, and legally you could probably find ways to prevent that. And then B landscapes are these in-betweens, and we have a lot of these in Oregon where they are scenic. There's a big project right now that's proposed down in the Christmas Valley. It's a big solar energy project. Christmas Valley, in my view, is scenic, but it's not an A scenery. It's more of a B scenery. And it needs some consideration to make sure that it's not lost. But it shouldn't be just an open door like the C landscapes would be. So I think there's ways to do this. I don't think it'd be all that difficult. And I think it's very important to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. Great. Well, thank you all for the conversation on this. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, our goal is to really be able to be a little more agile, to be able to adapt to things while not creating a super amount of uncertainty for developers. So if there is some methodology that we can use to, you know, address things, create this inventory or easily identify important scenic resources that aren't already identified in a plan, we will definitely try to incorporate that at least in our analysis and see if we can come up with a good recommendation that strikes that balance. But since we have about 12 minutes left in our scheduled time, and I want to be respectful of that to everybody, let's move on to our recreation opportunities thing and issue. And I think this is actually dovetails nicely with some of the things that we just talked about. But whereas the scenic resources standard is based on those land management plans and inventories already created in those land management plans, The recreation opportunity standard is more open and it's criteria based. And so in the application, the applicant must identify all recreation opportunities and then must provide an assessment of which opportunities are important based on a set of 5 criteria. And the council has the ability to agree or disagree with that assessment. And those 5 criteria are whether or not there's any special designation or management of the location, the degree of demand for the recreation opportunity, any outstanding or unusual qualities, the availability or rareness of the recreational opportunity in that area, and the irreplaceability or irretrievability of the opportunity. So whether or not the development of an energy facility would be a permanent impact, as well as one that would be not able to be mitigated in some way. These criteria, I believe, come from similar language in the land use planning goals, or at least from the OARs from that Land Development and Land Conservation and Development Commission has adopted. And we had a stakeholder ask if these criteria were clear or not, or basically recommend that they needed to be more clear. So I think that we just like to hear any input people have on these criteria. And unfortunately, I messed up my slide here. So I guess I just like to hear any general impact on these criteria, whether there should be some different process rather than a general inventory and assessment of importance, or whether this criteria, this approach might be appropriate for the scenic resources standard, which kind of seems to be somewhat what was being suggested, although it sounds like there is a more defined sense of what is a scenic resource versus a recreation opportunity out there. And Rachel and Dean, I see your hands are both still up, but I'm not sure if you have a new.
Mine is meant to be down, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Okay, does anybody have any thoughts on these criteria, or just general thoughts about the recreation standard? We didn't have a lot of specific issues on this, so we're open to hearing pretty much anything, any suggestions. Go ahead, Fuji.
Hi, Chris. I just think, personally, I think recreation opportunities may even be easier to deal with than the scenic. But I just want to say, I think this is a great place to bring the tourism industry in to play. That sector is missing, and this is a great place for them. They really know this very well. So that's my input.
And the hotel and
Hotel, motel folks, associations, yeah. They know the recreation stuff the best. So, thank you.
Thanks.
We're not buying any more Ace tape ever.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah. Any other comments on recreation, just for the good of discussion? If not, we have a few minutes left. Does anybody want to make any, well, I guess we should discuss our next steps. So we've got through all the issues we've identified, and a few additional things have come up, but it sounds like they are things that we need to do some more research on our side, and we have some more resources that we need to look at before we make our final recommendations. But I think my proposal is still that we do that work, we update our issues document, and then we circulate the draft proposed rules to the public for an initial review before we go back to the council with our final recommendations. I'll just ask if anybody has any issues or concerns with that approach. You know, feel free to say so now or send me a note. But I think at this point we are not planning on scheduling additional workshops.
I'm sorry, can you repeat, Chris, what you're going to come up with the draft rules and then what was next?
We'll come up with draft proposed rules and then we'll circulate those to the public, to our rulemaking mailing list, and anybody that participated in the workshops before we go to the council with a final recommendation.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Sounds good.
And then, of course, there'd be a formal public comment period based on whatever the council approves for proposed rules. So it sounds like that's okay. Jocelyn?
Chris, just one question. What are you thinking of for timing? It sounds like you've gotten a lot of input from folks that you're going to be processing and perhaps doing some additional outside research. Do you have any sense of approximately when we might expect to see the updated analysis and staff's recommendations?
I don't have a firm date, and we can try to kind of look and see where we're at and get that out. I will be honest that I am not optimistic about getting a draft out before the new year, but probably that December, January timeframe would be what I would I would be shooting for. But yeah, don't I guess don't take that as gospel, because that may change.
Thanks.
I can't say that we can get together the meeting notes from these workshops relatively quickly and probably publish a revised timeline at that time as well. And I would expect that to come out in the next month at the latest. Fuji?
I just want to clarify from this graphic you have here. So, and you're going to send out the meeting information, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have your draft December, January timeframe. You're saying then that is going to go to the council? And
we would send this first draft out to you all first, and then revise it based on feedback, and then send that to the council.
Okay, and then when it goes to the council, are you still prior to the next step of notice of proposed rulemaking? So we're still—
Yeah, when it goes to the council, we would be asking them to make a decision based on the draft that we take them, and then they would authorize the issuance of a notice of proposed rulemaking, and that was a formal process.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no other hands and hearing no comments. Thank you everybody for the really great conversation today. I think we got a lot of valuable input and certainly a lot to think about. And we will definitely be thinking about all these issues carefully. We may be reaching out to some folks with for some of the technical information that we talked about today as this process goes on. But if anybody has any materials or advice that they'd like the council to consider, you can send it to fsec.rulemaking@energy.oregon.gov, or my personal email is christopher.clark@energy.oregon.gov. And I'm happy to discuss this stuff with you, or again, anything that you send us we'll consider. Otherwise, we'll be planning on, like I said, publishing the audio from this workshop getting our meeting notes together with a revised timeline together in the next month or so, and then probably be looking at proposed rules, draft proposed rules for public review in early 2022. With that, thanks again for your time, and yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.